Journey was a unique game in 2012, a game without fighting, unlockables, or a word of dialogue, a multiplayer game where traditional communication or competition wasn't possible. For critics and players, it was a breath of fresh air against increasingly similar AAA experiences, but 10 years after its release, does Journey still hold the magic that it once did? Before I get into my experience, I want to briefly look at the game's development and the context of its release. I've linked some GDC talks from the developers, which will be a better representation of the events than I can give you here. Journey was developed by That Game Company as a PlayStation 3 download exclusive game. This was part of their 3-game deal with PlayStation, which saw them release Flow in 2006, Flower in 2009, and Journey in 2012. The development for Journey began right after the release of Flower in 2009, and Sony expected them to have the game finished by 2010. This didn't happen. The developers wanted to create a new type of multiplayer experience never seen before. They wanted the game to elicit certain emotions, and they felt like it was failing at doing that. Internally, the team couldn't agree on anything and was frustrated with the project. The entire development process was marred by miscommunications, delays, struggles, and finally, bankruptcy. In the final months, the team was out of money and out of time, but they still persisted and were able to release the game on March 13th, 2012 as a PlayStation Network exclusive. When the game released, it was met with extremely high praise. Many outlets were giving the game nearly perfect scores, with media outlets calling it a unique artistic experience. And it's no surprise, Journey really was a unique experience amid a backdrop of modern military shooters, space operas, and annual sports games. This was in 2012, in the middle of what I would call the indie game moment. This was the same year that saw the release of Fez, Mark of the Ninja, Dear Esther, FTL, Spelunky, The Walking Dead, and Hotline Miami. People were still surprised that a game by a small team or group of developers could have the same level of polish as a large $100 million extravaganza. In many ways, 2012 was the year that it all came together for these indie games, cementing them as an important pillar of gaming culture. Indies were quickly showing that games didn't need to be whatever a corporate boardroom said that they should be. Today, of course, this is a different story. You can easily find 8 games like Journey. Nowadays, everybody plays indie games. They're pretty ubiquitous part of a balanced gaming diet. But in 2012, all of these things were still very fresh, and within the context of its release, Journey was a truly unique experience. I'm going to approach talking about this game in a different way than the other videos I've made in this series. I want to tell you about my journey, pointing out the things that I think the game does well and poorly along the way. I would call it a stream of consciousness video if I didn't write it all down beforehand and edit the shit out of it. This means I'll likely be spoiling the entire experience if you haven't played it. While I'm not the biggest fan of the game as a whole, it's only about 2 hours long and costs almost nothing, so I would recommend you play the game before watching this. Who knows, you might end up enjoying the game more than I did. That's your spoiler warning. You can skip to the timestamp on screen to see my spoiler-free conclusions. Otherwise, let's start at the start. The game starts with a brief cinematic opening, showing a seemingly endless desert and a single figure. That figure is the player character. Without much build-up, the game hands off the controls and you're free to go in whatever direction you feel fit. I can tell that the game wants me to go straight forward because it only made me point the camera in that direction, but being a capital G gamer, I went in the exact opposite direction. This is where I learned that the game has a clever solution to keep you within the play area. Wind. Instead of an invisible wall, this game uses high winds to blow you back into position. I like when games find clever ways to keep you in bounds, and this is one of the smarter ones that I've seen. Realizing that there's only one way to get where I need to go, I start my trek forward. This is where the game teaches me my second lesson. Climbing is hard. In most games, our main characters have the quads of Jay Cutler and can go through any terrain with ease, but here we have tiny pencil legs, and they can really only do so much on these slopes. Once we get to the top of the hill, the camera pans up to show us a mountain way off in the distance, and this is the game's silent way of saying, hey, that's your objective. Side note, what is up with indie games and mountains? Celeste, a short hike, insurmountable, even something like Getting Over It is all about a mountain. Anyways, after a title flash, the game gives back control. Moving forward, we learn another thing about the game. You can ski down the slopes. Moving through the tombstones takes us to our first real obstacle, a destroyed building. We don't have a jump yet, so we have to clumsily step our way up to the top. Once at the top, we're given a scarf. This allows us to jump, but unlike most games, the scarf needs to be recharged between jumps. Continuing through the graveyard teaches us that you can recharge the scarf by coming into contact with any kind of cloth. There's a lot to like about this opening. First is that the game just starts. Slow starts are one of the worst things a game can have. You only get one chance to make a first impression, and this game clearly had a lot of thought put into the opening moments. It lets you in to start exploring right away. The second great aspect is how the game shows and doesn't tell. We normally talk about show not tell design in films or books or other narratives, but it can apply to gameplay too. Journey teaches most of its gameplay functions without explicitly stating them, only showing the basic controls and letting the players figure out the rest. The best tutorial is one that doesn't feel like one, and this is a great example of that. The story also does take a show don't tell approach. There isn't any spoken or written dialogue in the game, which is a pretty bold choice, and it also leaves the story pretty vague. But in these opening moments, I was filled with a curiosity about what this new world had in store for me. Further down the line is the first platforming challenge that I handled with no real struggle at all, and with that I was on to the next level. The second level presents us with a broken bridge and nothing else. The whole level is an environmental puzzle, and it took me far longer to figure that out than I would like to admit. This level had my first interaction with the game's multiplayer. I knew the general idea of it. There's no names, there's no faces, there's nothing to really let you know who the person is, but it nonetheless caught me off guard to see another person in the game. Following them led me to solve the puzzle by interacting with these machines, and with that I was on to the next level. The third level is where I started to sour on the game a bit. See, Journey has power-ups in the form of little collectibles that let you extend your scarf. These power-ups in turn make traversal more enjoyable and easier. This is a good thing, but what isn't a good thing is getting to the end of the level only to realize that I pretty much missed all the collectibles. I wasn't worried about not being able to finish the game or anything, but in a game that's been mostly characterized by slow movement around large areas, you best believe your boy wanted more jumps to speed that process up. Searching for these collectibles led me to do a little bit of a Moses roleplay as I wandered the desert for what felt like 40 years. This level had me the most conflicted about the game design. On the one hand, the idea of a large open environment with a bunch of little oases filled with collectibles sounds cool. On the other hand, I just don't think this game's made for that. The movement's too slow and the sense of direction is so purposely vague that it makes the experience of searching around for pieces more tedious than it has to be. I felt like the game wasn't sure what it wanted me to do. In a way, it was sending me mixed signals. The designers would surely know that showing a player like me that I've missed collectibles is going to result in me going back out to find them, but I feel like the game also didn't really want me to do that for how unfulfilling and unfun that task ultimately was. If the game never showed me that I missed anything, I wouldn't have went out to search for it in the first place. Typically, I'm all for giving the player a large amount of information about the game, but in this type of game, I feel like not knowing these details would have helped me have a more enjoyable experience because I wouldn't have went out and made a tedious task for myself. After 40 years, I climbed back up the tower, watched another cutscene, and was off to the next level. This level starts with a large ski slope, which kind of puts the game on rails for a few moments, and it lets you take in the environment. Unlike the desolated desert of the previous level, this level has a bunch of ruins all over the place. We're still in the same general environment as before, but due to the change in time of day and focus on structures, it feels like a completely new place. My mind started to think of all the ruins around me. I could imagine exploring through them to find more scarf pieces or maybe some other kinds of treasure, but as soon as those ideas slipped in, I was pushed out the end of the slide to see another player. I never saw anyone in the previous level, so it was refreshing to see another person again. This person, unlike the last one, actually interacted with me in one of the few ways you can interact in the game. They let out a simple sound. In Journey, there's no voice chat, no emotes, no real way to interact with somebody besides jumping and making noises. And while these noises fill other gameplay purposes like calling cloth towards you, they feel tailor-made for socialization. Since I didn't want to be rude, I made noises back. The back and forth reminded me of two birds having a conversation. This is where I realized the gameplay benefits of having another person on your journey. As the game taught us, being next to cloth regenerates our ability to jump. Other players are covered in cloth, so being near them regenerates both of our scarves. Like most things in Journey, this wasn't explicitly shown, and I didn't make the cloth connection right away. It wasn't until I was near them that I noticed there was an interaction at all. My brain actually humanized this simple mechanic, conjuring up the idea of two people sharing warmth in a cold, strange place. Knowing that the stranger could be helpful from a gameplay perspective, I decided to try and stay near them, not only for the free jumps, but also to help me search for more collectibles. This companionship was short-lived though, as my newly found partner sat down in the sand only to be gone a moment later. It didn't really bother me, as my mind was really stuck on the power-up that I missed at the top of the slide. I had to find a way back up there. I tried a few times to no avail. I stood on top of the wall and considered what to do. I knew that dropping down the other side would forfeit my chance of ever getting the collectible. I let out a call, hoping that the cloth would come over to me and carry me to the collectible. Sadly, the cloth never came over, but to my surprise, there was a response from another player. Not only was I not as alone as I thought I was, but this player was going after the exact same collectible that I was. I tried jumping from the platform, but I landed short. I let out calls, hoping that they would drop down and fill my scarf up, but they didn't. Instead, they showed me that I could ride the cloths up to the platform. I must have just been doing it wrong the first time. I was happy to finally have that collectible, and I was ready to get out of the pit. I stood at the ledge with my new travel companion, and after a few calls back and forth, we leaped into the unknown below. It was during this second ski trip that I started to connect with Journey a little bit more. I still found the gameplay to be lacking, but the game did just provide me with a unique social experience. I started to look at the game more as an art piece about the role of communication and cooperation, and less like a traditional video game. In an ironic twist, taking away so many aspects of what makes somebody a human made the other player feel more like a human. Stripping everything away makes the other player feel less like a means to an end and more like a companion. This section is where everything really came together: the art, the music, the multiplayer gimmick. If the entire game was more like this, I probably would have had a more positive experience with it, but my moment of introspection was cut short as my new companion and I were spit out of the slide and onto the next level. The first thing that I noticed about this level is a change in color palette. None of the materials had changed, but the palette had changed to cool blues and off-whites, making the reddish color of our cloaks really stand out. Me and my companion traveled out into this strange underground landscape, pointing out to one another when we missed collectibles. I noticed there was a section with pieces of cloth sticking straight up, and I couldn't help but feel like we were on the ocean floor. That's clearly what the game wanted me to think, as the next section had cloth jellyfishes to really bring the whole look together. If there's one aspect the game consistently nails, it's the visuals. You could print out just about any screenshot and put it on your wall and it would look great. But Journey isn't just a collection of beautiful frames, it's still a game that you have to interact with, and I was once again felt pretty wanting in this section. Even the introduction of the first and only enemy didn't spice up the gameplay enough to make it feel meaningful. Instead, the new enemy introduced very basic stealth mechanics and not much else. I was hoping for some kind of challenge, but that wasn't the case. Like most parts of Journey, we beat the challenge by simply moving forward and not much else. My brain was on autopilot for this level, as the level wasn't hard enough to be entertaining or visually unique enough to be memorable. My thoughts drifted back to all the things that the game could be, all while I struggled to hold my interest on the game that I was actually playing. This level starts with another palette change to try and keep the visuals fresh. This time we're in a cold, desolate snowscape. Snow's a smart progression because the devs can reuse the same sand physics that they've been using for the whole game. This level reintroduces the snake enemy within the first few moments, but this time he's not the main gimmick of the level. That would be bad weather. This level reuses the high winds I talked about at the very front of the video, except instead of working as an invisible wall, it activates on a timed pattern. This creates a challenge of moving behind items so the wind doesn't blow you away. Like most of our challenges, me and my companion cleared this puzzle without any real struggle, continuing up the mountain to a broken bridge, only for my companion to fall straight off the side. I think it says a lot about the game that I decided to jump down and rejoin them. I knew that there was nothing positive down there. I wasn't going to be rewarded with power-ups or collectibles or anything else, but I still went down there. To my own detriment, I jumped down to rejoin my companion. At that moment, I didn't know if they would have done the same for me, but I did it for them. As we climbed back up, I thought about what just happened. Despite me finding the basic gameplay of Journey dull, boring, and unfulfilling, I was somehow acting outside of my normal self. This odd little indie game made me make a sacrifice that I wouldn't even consider in any other game. Before I knew it, I was snapped back out of it as we were back to where we once were, crossing the bridge to be greeted by a frozen tundra and our old snake pal. We were once again thrown into a painfully basic stealth system that would have been tedious if it wasn't so brief. Making it past the monster, we continued to climb higher and higher. We got to a part where the wind kept blowing me back, despite me swearing that the timing was right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and go with the old gamer's best defense and blame the lag. During this encounter, something else interesting happened. When I was blown off the side of the steps and onto the platform below, my partner risked it all and jumped off after me. Maybe they were just repaying the debt from moments earlier when I risked anything. Maybe they didn't want to travel alone. I'll never know why they did what they did, but that action made our unspoken bond stronger than before. My companion and I climbed an alternate route to get to the top of the stairs, braving weather that only seemed to get worse. Making a vain effort to continue our ascent, we nearly lost each other in the snowstorm, but after their sacrifice, I was committed to try and stay close to my friend, but it was all for naught, as we collapsed one by one in the blinding snow. But then, like the Holy Reverend Kid Cudi, we became two speeding bullets to heaven. Noticing that my scarf was like 4 times the size of me, I decided to hold down the jump button for as long as I could. Finally, the game felt like it was giving me some kind of movement-based freedom. I was happy to see that my buddy was also revived, and he took off after me. Together, we were blasting through the obstacles with ease. I made it to the top of the mountain before my friend. In front of me was nothing but blinding light, so I turned around and waited for him to join me. After they landed next to me, we let out a few calls before trudging towards that light. I noticed our scarves were gone. It was like the first few moments of the game all over again. Nothing but walking forward without any real idea of what laid before us. The key difference this time is I had a companion, and we'd been through a journey together. With nothing else to occupy our time, we called back and forth to one another. I'm not sure what they wanted to tell me in those moments. And looking back, I'm not sure what I wanted to say either. I was just wrapped up in the moment, hoping for some kind of greater adventure. As the music swelled and the light got brighter, I think we both knew that there was no new adventure. This was the end of the road, the physical manifestation of the light at the end of the tunnel. We chirped at each other more quickly, like two longtime friends fitting a lifetime's worth of conversation into one final goodbye. As the light grew, I could still see their signs, but I couldn't hear them. There was no more noise. The path narrowed and we walked side by side, only for the path to collapse to a single file width. They went through the blinding light and I followed, only to be shown nothing but pure white. The game was over. As the credits played, I thought about my journey. Despite the last 2 levels being significantly more moving than the rest of the experience, I couldn't help but feel hungry. Even with those more emotional moments, I couldn't help but feel like the game wasn't a game enough. As I stared at the title screen, I realized that I was going to need a few days to really collect my thoughts on how I felt about what I just played. In case you skipped here or it hasn't been clear from the other parts of the video, I don't dislike Journey. Journey is by no means a bad video game, but I just don't understand the hype around it. Journey succeeds in many aspects. The game is visually stunning even 10 years later. The simple art design lets these images really pop with sharp contrasting colors. The lack of a HUD or other gamey elements allows you to get immersed in a way that most games could only dream of. The music follows what's happening on screen so closely that it feels like it's being composed for you on the fly. But when I judge a video game, I take all aspects into consideration, and while it succeeds in other aspects, it falls short in the most important aspect to me, the gameplay. Some might say that I shouldn't judge it this way because it's not trying to be a video game, it's an artistic expressionist piece. I take issue with that sentiment for a myriad of reasons. The first is that all games are pieces of art. Just because this game is more ethereal and traditionally artsy doesn't make it more or less of an artistic statement than a game like Modern Warfare 2. Every video game is a collection of different artistic mediums coming together, but gameplay is its own art style. Like any other art style, there's not an objectively good standard of gameplay. There's no formula that will automatically make the game fun. Gameplay is as subjective of an experience as looking at a painting or listening to a song. Of course, there's some gameplay decisions that could be objectively bad, like save states not working or other bugs, but there's no formula for objectively good gameplay. That's why I'm not going to say something like Journey's gameplay is bad. It's completely serviceable to the game that it's trying to be. This game's trying to be an art exhibition about the nature of communication, and to that front I do think it succeeds. But as a video game, I can't say that I resonated with it. Journey consistently left me feeling hungry. Journey left me starving, and I just don't think it needed to. The game could have opened up to let me explore different areas. It could have had more in-depth puzzles. It could have had platforming challenges that were a challenge. It could have had all these things, and I don't think any of those additions would have taken anything away from the artistic accomplishment that they were trying to do. But the more I thought in this direction, the more I thought about this game, the more I thought that this just isn't a game for me. Me asking Journey to add all of these things to make it more like a traditional video game is no different than begging for an easy mode in the Souls games. In both cases, there is a clear artistic reason that the gameplay is the way that it is. For Souls games, it's so that people can have an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, and then they can share the suffering that they've went through with other fans. For Journey, it's so everyone gets a chance to experience the magic that only video games can bring. You could have Journey be somebody's first video game or their last video game. It's one of the most accessible games I've ever played. And while I can appreciate all the things that the game's trying to be and all the things that the game does accomplish, it's not a game that I would recommend to everybody. I'm not going to put it on my own personal top 100 list. I can't say that this is a game you need to play before you die. I can understand why people might put it on a list like that, but no matter how I twist my mind to look at it, the gameplay is just too sparse and the experience overall is just too dull for me to put it on the same kind of pedestal. I'm personally glad that I went on the journey that I did. I'm glad that I was able to experience it with another person, which is apparently the ideal way to play the game. I don't think that any of it was a waste of my time. I'm not begging for the 2 hours back. I just can't bring myself to put a game on my top 100 list that I didn't outright enjoy. But I really do want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Journey is highly regarded by fans and critics. Maybe I'm just missing something. Have you played Journey? Would you put it on your own top 100 list? I'm very curious what people have to think about this. It's a very good game. It's just not something that I would put on my own personal top list. I hope that you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
That's right, we're Japanese.